For those of you that don't know my name is Hunter, one of the other co-hosts of the Laravel Austin Meetup, and I'll be your pilot for this evening. Our agenda's not that big. We have Adam talking about inversion recursion, building smart apps with big data. I don't have any slides or anything, but afterwards I'd like to do a little quick overview of some of the things that are coming up in Laravel 4.3, and then encourage you to go look online. There's tons of posts now, as well as Laracast videos on all the features and sneak peeks. And then, as always, end with a little bit of a Q&A. If no one really has any good questions, I got emailed some, I think Sunday night, that I can pop out and see what people have to say. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam now.
All right, what's the Apple TV called?
This one is co-working.
All right, so like we said, we're going to be talking about inversion recursion today. I changed it from big data to dumb data just specifically because of the app that I have to build. Okay, so to start things off, who am I? My name is Adam Kelso. I'm a full-stack LAMP developer. I work at Atomic Access. And while there, my technical title is front-end developer. And on the side, I develop a project called Jubilee Solutions, which is a real estate app. And I'll go through all the technical bit about it. And it's going to be kind of the focus of the group tonight. So this discussion is about building apps with several large, potentially contradictory rule sets or data sets. And because of this, I had to figure out a way to push dependency inversion and the open-close principles kind of to the extreme. So I hope everybody is a little brushed up on solid. If not, it doesn't really matter, it should be okay. And along the way, I'm going to talk about several pitfalls and gotchas that I learned while working on an actual project. Because a lot of times we, in presentations like this, we hear about all the cool stuff, but we don't always see the actual implementation or an actual real use case. Okay, so to start things off, Jubilee.com is a service where customers can purchase reports to protest their yearly property taxes. So every year, whatever county you live in, they evaluate your property and then tax you based on that. It's a certain percentage and it changes per county, but it's to the county's benefit to charge you as much as possible. One, because they get more revenue streams, and two, because it makes their county seem more desirable for new people moving in to want to live in. So we take an address and we search for similar properties around you based on size, based on age, and on several different things. And the ones that are most similar or most helpful to you, we will calculate together what is the lowest possible value we can evaluate your house for. And so basically, the lower the property's value, the lower the taxes are going to be for the homeowner. Now, would you want to do this? Obviously for tax reasons. This is not meant for people who are homeowners that are trying to sell. This is meant for people who are happy with where they're staying and they want to stay. So basically, primarily, it's a big report that we generate. So we go through a lot of different things. We have not only the data about your home, but about all the comparison properties. Maps are generated about all the comparison properties around you, all the data itself, all the calculations that are required to prove that your house's value is not as high as the state says it is. And then we even include the forms that you would use to protest the county's evaluation of your property. So it's a lot of PDF generation. Big thing, the average one is about 45 pages when it's generated. So the difficult part. Each county is allowed by the state to choose both their own format for storing data and their own requirements for how you protest, or what algorithms you use to protest. So this means that for every county we want to support, we have potentially a completely different way of proving somebody's property's value. So what really sucks about that is we have 254 counties in Texas. And in the entire US, there's more than 3,000. So this could be a huge nightmare to work with. So what I was tasked to do is to expand the app that was in prototype stage from 1 county to 10, and that's going to be the case next year when taxes come out, but allow an infinite number and for data sets to be easily updated and fully searchable. Now, understand that this is not an insignificant amount of data. Most data dumps from each county is going to be anywhere from 2 to 4 gigs on plain text files, and it's usually available every 2 weeks. For example, the main county that was available in the prototype is Harris County in Houston, and it's the largest county in Texas. 4.5 gigs every 2 weeks. That's a little difficult to work with sometimes. And of course, we have to customize the report formatting by each county, using the different algorithms that were required. So the existing code, when I was brought on board, I did not build the initial, but I get to work with it. So it was over Harris County, and it was built in CodeIgniter. And as a normal prototype, it was minimum viable product. So they went as fast as they could through the project and made the code as messy as possible sometimes, it seems like. And basically everything that's returned from your SQL queries is run through a big for each loop, and just running through every possible calculation that might be needed on each property. It works just fine, but it's terrible to try to expand. And if I wanted to expand it to a lot of other counties using that same method, I would probably have to use a lot of switch statements everywhere. You imagine that, 254 counties worth of stuff. It's like, huge thing. And just Harris alone has about 100 calculations you have to do in a specific order in order to prove a property's value. So where to start? I wanted to port to Laravel, of course, obviously. Somehow I needed to inject required classes dynamically at runtime, rather than just be injectable by the normal ways we go about in Laravel. We usually just will set in a big config file, just say bind here, but I needed each one to be based on the county that's uploaded or chosen at the time. I needed to share as much logic as possible. And we also needed to allow slight variations between counties that share the same system. One thing I forgot to mention here is that most counties in Texas use one of 6 main systems to keep and store their data. These are made by private companies, so they're usually handled pretty well. Consistent and makes sense way of storing data, and they also make recommendations about what algorithms should be used for when you protest. Unfortunately, they're just recommendations. The county is under no obligation to follow them, so a lot of counties follow them slightly, but not fully, and have their own changes. Harris, on the other hand, was completely proprietary. So everything was made specifically to their specifications. So even though you may have a lot of counties that share a lot of processes, not all of them are going to be exactly the same. So first to start off with, I wanted dynamic class injection. So I realized whenever you're going to be generating a report, first off, it's always going to be available to pass in what county you want to use. So either a get or a post. So I have just a simple config file that's in the config folder for all the different counties of which kinds of classes they need to resolve to. So you see I have a search class, property class, insert class, and other things. And then at runtime, in the app's start global file, we're basically just checking to see if this input has been used, and if it is, go ahead and resolve those classes or bind them before any controller action or model action actually happens. So that's how I got around that. That one's pretty easy. But finding best comparisons, this is where it started to get a little bit difficult. So after SQL queries were returned with either several dozen or sometimes several hundred comparisons in a neighborhood, we need to quickly find the most helpful of 10. So I was thinking, how do I go about this? The first thought, of course, is when you're looking at the prototype code, it does a for each loop. Well, maybe I should go about doing that. But as you can see, this is actual code from the original prototype. Yeah. I mean, if you know the jargon, a lot of those things can make sense, but for somebody just starting on the project, no, not really. And again, if you could use a for each loop, a different for each loop for each county in a different file, that would work fine, but there's a lot of downfalls to that. One, it's procedural code. I mean, so it's just going to run in sequence from beginning to end. And it's incredibly difficult to have to either format or to go back and change things if any algorithms ever change. Because goodness knows, government's never going to come and say, oh, we want something different. So I was looking for a better way to do that. There are other problems with the for each loop is that you end up writing God classes, meaning that it doesn't separate concerns and a search class is responsible for everything. So whenever you use procedural code for long-winded processes, you're kind of missing the point of object orientation, is that it's invented so that you have brevity, organization, dryness, and lots of other advantages. So what I wanted was a clean way to set and get variables on a property class, and I wanted to have them automatically resolve. You know, that's one of the big things about Laravel that everybody loves is the automatic dependency injection resolution. So I was wondering if there was a way to do that for individual attributes on a given class. Property class adjustments, or calculations, but the counties all call them adjustments. They should be clean, simple, and separated, rather than that huge for each loop that was just a big array of ugliness. And I wanted to lazy load adjustments, meaning only, obviously, meaning only fire an adjustment or a calculation when it's needed. And I needed it to be infinitely extendable. The reason why it needs to be that is, first off, it makes sense, but two, some counties require only a few calculations. Some require literally hundreds, almost 1,000. Harris, I believe, is not actually the worst, even though they have this huge amount of data and really odd requirements. I think Dallas might actually be worse because they also have the proprietary format. But anyway, first, what I did was I looked through Laravel's base code, just to understand how Taylor built his IOC container. Now, if you're watching any of the videos that came out around Laracon this year, Jeffrey Wade went over this a little bit too, although he was using a different version number of Laravel that I'm looking at here. But anyway, these four main functions or methods are actually used recursively in order to fill in dependencies that are required of a class. So basically, when a new class needs to be instantiated, it'll look through all the dependencies with the get dependency method, then it'll run the build. Build will look at what dependencies are required. Then on each of those, we'll do resolve non-class or resolve class. And in each of those, they'll also call the get dependencies method and then the build method down and down and down recursively as needed. So just to refresh everybody's mind of what recursion is, I'm sure most of us know in here, but you know. So basically you have a function or method or sets of those, and the items are passed in. Then the function runs, and it tests whether or not it can resolve or fulfill those items. If it can't, or if it can, it will kick out the answer, great. But a lot of times it can't. So what it'll do is it'll actually call itself again with a subset of the items or arguments, and then run again. And if it doesn't work again, it'll do this over and over and over again until it finally gets to a point where it resolves. Once that answer is resolved, it'll return that to the latest tier or level, I guess you could say, of the function, run, whatever, until all of them are finally resolved all the way back up, or it throws an error. So one of those two. An example of this, of course, would be one that I had at work where I had to format SCORM data and I wanted to use it as an array or an object. I don't know if anybody has any experience with SCORM, but it's used in learning management systems and it's just a format for keeping track of student usage. But anyway, it has this annoying, really annoying name spacing scheme here on the top. So that's really not useful when you're working with programming terms. So a more useful format would have been as an array or object, which I wanted to get in this bottom example. So you can do that by creating a function that will recursively walk through and look for each namespace in an array. And then if it exists, it'll add it. If it doesn't, it will call itself again with a smaller subset. And then once that function is created, we just use it as any other function or class method. So it's just a simple example of recursion right there. Okay, so that's great, but how do I use this, in my case, in the real estate app? I really wanted to use this as intelligently as possible since, you know, the plan ahead, otherwise you're going to screw yourself in the end thing. So I was, without any other real direction of how to handle this, I started researching intelligent systems or artificial intelligence. and searching algorithms. And I would say that's a very intimidating field to look at if you've never done it. I highly recommend it though, it's very enlightening. I ran into swarm theory. If you're a geek like me, you've probably heard this before and cheesed out about it, but basically it states that relatively simple but self-leading agents, when in a group, will lead to intelligent behavior as a group. And of course, it's seen in many places in nature. So, for example, schools of fish, swarms of insects, or even packs of wolves. And actually, it's been proven that humans, you can do this too if you consider humans a simple agent. That's a matter of opinion. But anyway, programmers use this theory all the time, whether it's in simulations, in video games, big data, anything really. So even though it might be debated whether or not 4 gigs is considered big data, I tried to use swarm theory in this. So what I wanted eventually was to have different property classes for each county that have simple setters and getters, like this first example. Some of the sets are a couple lines, but usually it's just property equals this, property equals this. And then have them prioritize, or the properties organize themselves by helpfulness, just by asking for a specific, asking them to sort themselves by a specific value that's returned. So the first thought that came to mind is, a lot of languages have public getters and setters on any property you might have. For example, in C#, it's just, you create a set and a get function. But it needs to work a little bit differently in PHP, of course. We all probably know that we have class-wide sets and gets that are magic methods. And because of this, since I knew the same functions were going to be running for each of these, I wanted it to run as cool as possible, meaning I didn't want any extra calculations to ever run or any extra processing to run when they didn't need to. Another big problem with the for each loop I talked about before is that every single calculation possible or that may be needed for any property was being run every time. It's really inefficient because even though in order to return your evidence to the county, you have to include all these hundreds of calculations, there's only a subset of maybe 50 or 60 that is actually required that we know after that point we can know that this property is either going to be helpful or not. So I wanted to have that run only when necessary, and so we needed to lazy load. And I also wanted everything to work efficiently and only ever run once. So how do you do that on individual classes and have everything act the same way? And along those lines, I wanted everything to invert. So each calculation may have an infinite number of dependency calculations since they all have to be done in a specific order. So I needed an IOC container of sorts to be used internally in each class. And I also needed it to not rely on inheritance, because since some counties are similar, but they have slight variances, that would have been the perfect opportunity to have a parent class of the private company's special or specific measurements, and then each county that uses that to be a subclass. So in this one, I wanted it to span all these different classes without being required in the parentage. And so cache results, another one that came up was I needed to flush results if one of the settable properties ever changed, and usable without class inheritance. So obviously I used a trait for that, and I came up with after a lot of fiddling, the result was what I'm calling calcu-trait. Anyway, the trait is included in any class that overrides the setters and getters of that class, caches results, and inverts dependencies on any given method that's inside of it. When you use this trait, basically you have an array inside of it that's called settable, and you have all the different properties that can be settable all values that can be set on the property class. Name property is going to be difficult to get through, but here. But anyway, all of them are set to null at first. And of course, when you're working with magic methods, you can always have your public variables that work exactly like they're intended to all the time. And so on each gettable, I wanted those to automatically calculate. So an example of how I wanted to use it was in the first area here. So if you're working in views, you just want it to be a get variable. So what actually happens is there is private methods for each gettable value that we don't want to be settable. We only want it to be gettable. So for example, age and market value per square foot. They're fairly simple functions and they're nice and separated now, but I needed a way to invert how the dependencies are made. So you'll notice that there's a check function that I would insert every string or every dependency by name that would need to be done. And basically, the check function just goes through and makes sure everything runs, or everything exists in the calculated array. And of course, the calculated array doesn't have to be on your class that's in the trait itself. And if it exists, great, it returns it. Or it doesn't throw an error. And you can just use the get methods internally in your class. That's something not everybody realizes, that magic methods work internally in a class as well, not just externally. Kind of became an IOC container at object level. The check function recursively walks through first off to make sure that that method or that value either exists on the settable or calculated array. If it exists on the settable array, if it's something you set before, you'll just return that, no problem. Or, it's cut off at the end, but it just also checks if that method exists. If it exists, then it runs it, and it caches the value. If it doesn't, if it can't find an anywhere, it'll throw an error, actually, that's an invalid argument error, and we use debug backtrace. This is the same thing that if you use whoops or anything like that, which Laravel uses automatically. It's the same method. Whoops goes kind of to the extreme on that one a little bit more, but useful to have those kind of errors thrown at you. And then after all that is done, now that all the functions can run themselves only when they're needed, it's nice and easy to handle the swarm. So basically, after that, I just create a simple sort function that compares based on the value. And they automatically, all these properties will only do as much work as needed in order to sort themselves into the proper order as most helpful to least helpful. And then I can just array slice and take off the top array, or the top amount of items that are useful. So this ended up being really nice and useful in not just this project, but a few other projects I was either involved with at work or just other projects I have coming up on the side. And that all these different classes can interact fully and kind of nudge themselves, or to, kind of like a swarm of fish, direct themselves where they need to go without caring about how the other agents or the other classes in the swarm actually work. And I know this is nothing like super revealing about object-oriented programming, but I had never worked with it in this specific method before. And it actually increased the speed, surprisingly, of my searches or the calculations and generations of the PDFs by about half of what the normal speed was. Now, of course, that's not always going to be the case depending on the county, but for Harris, where they have several hundred calculations and you only need about half of them to decide whether or not it's going to be useful, that actually did speed up or increase the speed of the execution. And especially if you're going to be working with thousands or millions of classes or of objects, this is a really nice way to go about it. So why a trait? Wanted the feature to be usable without class inheritance, and we already talked about that. It's also a really small amount of code. It ended up only being 93 lines, and that's with comments and doc blocks. And also, just by the naming, traits are named what they are because they allow portability of behavior code. So objects that aren't necessarily from the same class can still have the same personality trait. I also wanted to use this in other places in the app, not just on properties, but also on some of the analytics that we're using. And there's, as you can imagine, with all these different types of disparate data, there's lots of different things we have to do with the data before it's even searchable. So that's really helpful. And also, you get a cheesy name off of it, so that's always a bonus. So a few pieces of advice from this. When you're working with large data sets, allow these objects to self-direct as much as possible. And that's not specific to Laravel or PHP. Any object-oriented language can use this same kind of method to get things working. And the majority of the work is likely going to be moving and importing data, which easily the majority of my work is that. But this is just the interesting stuff here on top. Use solid everywhere. They will save your life. And no matter what you do, sometimes your code is going to be ugly. There's no such thing as perfect code. Try to make it extensible, but extensible does not mean perfect. And again, study other software industries to get ideas. It can be very helpful. So my idea for this came from artificial intelligence and search algorithms. All right, so I kind of blazed through that. Any questions? Anything?
It's really fascinating on the development side. That's not my background, so I can't really ask anything about that. But on the business side of the app itself, am I understanding correctly that basically you're just looking, like if they come and say that my house is, they need to raise the value, you're going to look and say similar houses are equal or lesser than mine, so that's going to help me protest that raising the value, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because of the Freedom of Information Act, every county has to make publicly available their data for every property that's privately owned in their county. So that data is freely available, so we can just say, okay, based on your own rules, you're totally cutting it to this person. They should not be paying as much as you say they should. So,
and is that more often than not the case, that you can find enough data to support the fact that it's...
Most of the time, yes. There are a few occasions where there's not enough usable data, or they're just the unlucky person that their evaluation was actually spot on. We can't protest it. So you can do a public free search on the site, and it just won't generate a report. It'll just give you the final result. And sometimes we also can't calculate because the county may say that their property value is pending. That happens early on in the tax season sometimes, that they haven't just gotten around to it. And it's difficult because there's a lot of other random things that come up that are problems with the data itself. For example, a couple weeks ago we got one guy who's saying, okay, your system is saying that our property is pending its value, but it's not. It's publicly available on their website. So if you go to HCAD's website and you actually search for this property, yeah, it shows you all the values on their website, but their data dumps did not contain it. Their data dump still said that the value was pending. So I had to spend an entire night entering like this entire neighborhood's worth of values into the database to make sure it's actually correct. So that was a bit of a nightmare. But there are occasions where sometimes properties are, either the difference is negligible or it's not going to work. The ones that have the biggest problem are, not surprisingly, the most valuable property in a neighborhood. So if you live in a neighborhood that's, say, $400,000 per house, somebody has $1 million home, they're kind of screwed. So, yeah.
Now, what's to stop the county from like using that in reverse and trying to figure out whose property value is too low for the neighborhood and targeting those people?
Hadn't thought of that, but you know, that's a possibility.
Maybe there's a market for that, I don't know.
Yeah. There's a lot more people that are more interested in taking money away from the government than people who are interested in giving the government more money, so I'll go with that one. Yeah, along those lines though, of other markets you can push this into, I was talking about all residential properties, but commercial properties also get taxed every year. So we're also planning, maybe not this next year, but the year after that, having actual, either retail or commercial license or properties being calculated as well. And that one's also going to be really useful for the swarm thing, because in this swarm, all the objects are the same type of class, or the same class. But with the corporate ones, or the commercial properties, you actually have to compare it against every single actual property type around you. So some of them are commercial, some of them are residential, some of them are public. So that's going to be really helpful in that case.
What counties is it available in at the moment?
It's only available in Harris County right now, but the tax season is basically over. Our real season of when this is useful is from about April to the end of August. So nobody's really using it right now, but we're going to have 10 counties available, including Travis County, next year. So.
That's what I was looking for. Travis.
Yes, okay. Yeah, well, okay, next year we'll be supporting all of the counties around Houston, all the counties around Dallas-Fort Worth, around Austin, San Antonio, and Lubbock.
Sweet. So the forms, do you like automatically fill them out, or?
Yes, we do actually. Here, hold on a sec. Hold on. Okay, so if anybody was interested, this is what the interface looks like when you're working here. So basically, you would just enter your account number. Those are publicly available on whatever county's website you are working in. So Harris is the only one available right now, but there will be more later. And I'm also planning on implementing Elasticsearch later, so we can do some really interesting searching algorithms and different things like that. It will be really useful for geospatial stuff. But anyway, basically you would put in your account number, it would generate the report, and then, here, I'll just go ahead and download one of these. I have no idea whose person this property is until we get to their stuff. But all this stuff here at the beginning is just debate help or advice if you're going to protest your taxes.
Does it require a signature, or like, does it require the person that owns the property, like, for them to actually do something, or?
Yes, when you actually go fill out your protest, we include the forms here, but there are going to be a few places on the forms they give you only when you get there that you do have to put your signature on. Also, you can have a representative go for you. Those people are called agents, and they will actually do all your protesting for you, which is actually something we've had a lot of people asking us to do, is to make a marketplace for
agents.
Yeah, for agents. So whatever county you live in, they can use our software to generate their reports and have their own branding and everything on it. But then these people will actually go represent you to the county and fight your battles for you, which has been the bigger problem this year, is that the counties are trying to stiff people as much as possible. Just to give you an idea of the estimate, this year in Harris County alone, they had more than 500,000 protests actually filled out. Most of those are corporate, but good, I believe it's a quarter of them are all residential properties. And about 700 of them were our reports. And you know, when 700 of them going through the same office, people, they start to take notice and they got mad. And so there is two different protests that you have. You can either have your informal, which is just the officials at HCAD saying, okay, yes or no, we'll accept it, or we'll lower it or not. And then you have your formal, which is people who are citizens not employed by HCAD, but are experts in the real estate field that will actually review all your data. And so far, we haven't lost any of those that have actually gone all the way to the full formal review.
Sorry, I have more questions about the
Sure.
forms and stuff. Is it the same thing as the homestead stuff, or is it just the property? That's something different, right?
That one I have no idea about.
Like homestead exemption or something lowers your property tax.
Not that I know of.
Like if it's your primary residence versus like your vacation house or whatever.
Again, I'm sorry, I don't know exactly. I'm the programmer. My business partner he's the
business guy.
Yeah, the business guy. Yeah, he actually did this in Harris County for several years. Then his wife and he recently moved out to College Station. But anyway, so he would be the better person to ask for that. Sorry. I do know a few things that exemptions that we can't, or a few cases where we can't help people is if you purchase the property within the year that you're protesting, and if your house falls under certain exemptions, like if you're on welfare or something like that, which I'm surprised you're a homeowner then, but if that's the case, then you also don't pay property taxes, so different things like that. But anyway, so I mean, you saw a little bit of this report that's generated in slides. So this is just a little bit of how it works. Got a valuable property here. But anyway, so explanation of all the attributes, and of course, all these things in blue here are kind of the self-calculating things that I told you about earlier that are just grabbed from the swarm. So you have your subject property, and then here are all the comparison properties that are generated automatically with the internal IOC container. So anyway, any other questions?
How much does it cost to use it?
For a single report, it's $70, $69.99, yeah, $70. And if you want to order multiples, we have a 5-pack, a 10-pack, and then we have an unlimited one. And it's on the site about however much they all cost.
Is that like for 2014, 2015, like every year you would do it or something? Is that
You would repurchase every year, yeah. So we have a certain number, every time you purchase a report, it comes out as a credit, and we keep track of how many credits you've used. So every new property you have is a new credit.
and yeah, I guess if people own multiple properties.
Yeah, they have to buy a separate credit for each. The good thing though is, since the data changes so often every 2 weeks, we allow you, once you purchase one for a year, and your credits coincide with your properties, so that you're making reports on. So if you purchase one and then the data changes, you can refresh that later for free throughout the rest of the year, as many times as you want, and we'll recalculate it for you for free.
Something this kind of reminded me of is Clerk. Are you familiar with their?
No.
They are if you want to incorporate a startup in Delaware, they have basically an online form. You can just type in your business info and your address. They'll generate the forms for you. They print on a signature page, and then they submit it for you, like to the office, physically submit it.
Nice.
Email you the stuff. So I don't know if there's any way you guys can integrate in on that.
Well, most counties don't have a publicly accessible API, so that's the major concern. If they did, I would love to do that. People would love that too. It's like, oh, okay, it's generated for me, and then it's sent off to them. But yeah, there's no way to do that in the moment.
Yeah.
Any others? Okay, cool. There's a couple more things I wanted to mention. Since this was a talk about inversion recursion, a nice new feature that is going to be available in Laravel 4.3. Sorry to steal your thunder, Hunter. But one new feature is going to be dependency injection at method level. Now Taylor announced this at Laracon EU. And it's only going to be available in controllers, unfortunately. So if you want to use method injection in a model, you're still stuck by the controller.
Oh my gosh, that's so awesome.
Yeah, I know, that's still sweet.
I hate what I was thinking.
Yeah, so this was announced at Laracon EU last week or 2 weeks ago. But anyway, it's going to be arriving in November. You can still use it, but it's considered beta, so it's not really stable. And it's really useful for those occasions when you only need a dependency for one function and you don't want to use it everywhere, so it's kind of pointless to tie it to the constructor. But anyway, nice new feature that's available. And that's it. So thank you guys.
Sweet. Thank you once again, Adam, for a very, very interesting talk. I love the whole artificial intelligence and all those various theories. Hopefully y'all can't notice, but my screen's probably gonna glitch out for the rest of this as Flux tries to dim and then undims, dims and undims. So one of the many things that I wanted to go over in Laravel 4.3, this is gonna be kind of a quick overview. The videos are free on Laracast, so I'm not going to waste y'all's time of just playing the videos that you can go back and take off your pants and get a beer and sit in front of your own computer and watch. So a couple of things. There's a new directory structure coming around with Laravel 4.3, which I think is going to be the main thing that kind of scares people away, because I think the most question I've got is, where do I put this? And Laravel 4.2 structure is pretty cut and dry, but still people run into the problems of I don't know where to put stuff that doesn't fit into those folders. And then, so here is the current 4.3 directory structure. You can see that a few things that used to be nested in our app are now brought into the root directory, such as config, database, resources is a new one, which I believe is where the views are. Storage and then test has always been there. Inside of app, though, we get console, which is where your different artisan commands that you make will be stored, HTTP, and then providers. One thing is, I remember seeing this, but I can't for the life of me find the tweet that mentioned this, but there is going to be a service provider for 4.3 that you can load that will basically backwards compatible the 4.2 directory structure. But within the HTTP is where the controllers folder moved, instead of a filters.php file, they just had, I believe the syntax was like filter facet, create whatever, blah, 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 blah for the auth and all that. Now you actually have classes for each of those to give a bit more organization, as well as request, which is a new kind of cool class that ties into the method injection and controllers. And then your routes.php files here as well. Take your time. For the providers, you kind of get all the usual providers. Before, there used to be a artisan file under, I think it was app commands, and you just did artisan new, and then you passed in the instance of the new command class. Now you actually have a service provider to load in the various artisan commands, as well as the app, the error level, all your new filters, the log, and then the actual routes themselves. So the thing that I've kind of noticed with this directory structure is that he's kind of pushing for a he's kind of pushing some coding principles on you with this, but they're actually good ones that you should be learning and using anyway, which I think is nice because instead of getting kind of crap code that is encouraging not crap code. So, and then one thing, we've got the usual user model that just sits in the app folder. One thing you'll notice immediately is that in Laravel 4.2, you just had your models and that was it. And then you could namespace them or you could not, it didn't really matter. Now with 4.3, he's doing a big push towards everything being namespaced, including the models, which is actually a good principle to follow. So by default, you get namespace app. There is an artisan command that will allow you to automatically change the stuff that comes with it instead of using namespace app to whatever you want. So say Jubilee, if your namespace was Jubilee, then using the artisan command, it would auto-update everything that comes with 4.3, and then you're good to go, instead of having manual edit.
Question about the service providers thing. If there's a service providers directory for it, do you still have to register a service provider and app.php in the config file?
I'm gonna probably say yes. I don't think he's done auto magic to know what providers to load off of there, but we can also really quickly see if that's the case by clicking on these fancy links. This looks pretty much standard, and yes. So you can see all the fancy providers are namespaced for the actual application level, and then you've got the actual framework themselves, or the service providers themselves from Illuminate. So same thing with the aliases. I haven't really noticed change too much, so that's good. Excuse me. So method injection that Adam already talked about, which is very fancy. It ties into form request, which are fancy custom classes for validation and authentication stuff. The first example I can come up with using the method injection is for validation. Instead of having like a custom, there's validator make that's available in Laravel, but if you've gone the route of creating a custom class to handle the validation for, say, the user object, and in that class it stores the rules for a create and update instance and all that, instead of having to have the whole controller bring in that validation class for every request, even though it only gets used in 1 or 2 instances, you can now just method inject it into the method and have it for only those 2 instances. So that kind of ties into form request, which is basically exactly that. Jeffrey Way has some very fancy examples about it, but how the form requests work is all you have to do is write the class with the necessary methods, and it basically just runs the validation, takes in the data, the rules, and done. But what's nice, I think it's nice, some people have some varying opinions on it, is all you have to do to use it is put it in the method. Just typecast it into the method, and that's it. Because whenever the dependency resolution runs, if it's an instance of the form request class, it'll automatically fire. And if the validation fails, and this is the part where people are kind of iffy about it, all your stuff in the method never fires. It immediately calls its error function on the form request and goes back up the stack trace to wherever, unless you're catching it somewhere else further along. So usually you do the validation, say in like that controller method, and throw an exception or return a error response if the validation wasn't correct. Now instead of doing all that in the method, you're just doing that in a separate class, and all you need, pretty much the only code in your controller methods are going to be the everything's good to go validation passed code, except for maybe a few other things depending on your use case. So, no, he doesn't. Okay, I thought he had a couple of requests already there, but it doesn't look like it. But Jeffrey Way goes into a few, or making one of those form requests, which it's got the fancy artisan generate commands to basically make the class for you with the names, and the method's already there, so then you just plunk in your code and go. Contracts, which a little bit clunky, but basically a lot of Laravel is now being adhered to contracts or interfaces. But what's nice about these is that you can also use those same interfaces to decouple your code as much as possible and get away from having as many hard dependencies as possible. So, for example, I think these are more like the arrayable, JSONable, those various contracts that you can apply to your classes to basically say, hey, this thing can be turned into an array. For example, the Illuminate collections, and you can turn this thing into a JSON object, and it'll have this to JSON or to array functions on them. So those will be handy. File systems, before we've been kind of limited to just the local file system with Laravel. In 4.3, they're bringing in a very fancy package from the PHP League called Fly System, which will, on top of local file system, will give you access to, in a very unified Laravel API type way, S3, Dropbox, Rackspace, CloudFront, and if it doesn't have the driver for it, you can just make your own driver, load it in, and you're good to go. So that's pretty awesome. One of the things that I've been kind of excited about, not that I have any projects that would use it at the moment, but it's cool to be able to actually interact with the cloud storage systems. And then route caching. Route caching, I haven't actually had a chance to watch this Laracast, so I have no idea how it works, but this is something that you would do on the production server to basically speed up the route resolution of your application. So instead of it spending more time trying to figure out how to route the code, it loads in from the cache and routes things a lot faster, which I think is going to be a very nice performance boost. And there's a lot of other things. There's some new authentication that kind of ties into those form requests. And some stuff that hasn't even came out yet. Actually, it comes out tomorrow. Both of them will, the last things. Socialite. It has the word social in it, so using my brain, I can only assume it has something to do with Facebook and Twitter and all those various things.
It's an authentication driver that's based on...
Oh yeah, it uses, okay,
Yeah.
So that's awesome. And then the actual instructions on how to upgrade to Laravel 4.3, which are helpful as well, instead of having to figure it out ourselves, let Jeffrey Way figure it out for us and be happy. So,
When is it going to be released?
November.
November. So we got a little bit of waiting, but it's currently on the develop branch of Laravel on GitHub. So I think if you do the composer create project, you can actually tell it, hey, pull from develop branch and create a project directly from there. Excuse me. Be
So
on your
they're
way.
in release candidate stage, or like what's their process for
Beta.
beta?
Yeah, at the moment it's just beta until, I guess,
Until November.
Otwell decides, ready to go, push, and then it's up on Forge and Laravel.com and all those fancy things. So I think it's going to be a nice change in a good direction. I know they've been discussing various things like Simver and all that because it's a bit of a breaking change in some cases. So it's possible Laravel 4.3 could suddenly become Laravel 5 just to keep with Simver consistency, but who knows? That's just whatever. It's going to look like this. That's all I know. Who cares? It might be Laravel 6 because PHP is in apparently a skip version number phase at the moment, so who knows? But that's all I have for the Laravel 4.3 overview. So now we usually kind of devolve into a general QA at the end. So if anybody has any Laravel or PHP or programming practice questions that you haven't been able to find the answers to on Google or Stack Overflow, hit us. Hopefully someone here will have the answer, or multiple people will have parts of the answer to get you where we're trying to get to. But if no one has any questions, I can dig up the ones I got in my email. Looks like I'm looking to the email. I got these whatever day, yesterday. Philip had 2 questions that he emailed me about since in response to my looking for people for topics or people to give talks. And he brought up 2 questions. Error handling and validation the right or common way, which seems that we've been doing a lot of validation talk with 4.3, appropriate. What he was saying, sorry Philip if you ever see these, not trying to throw you under the bus. His thought was, how exactly do you handle the errors? Like what he does is like in production, suppresses them so that they don't throw intentionally, and then instead capture those errors and return them as messages to the user. And basically he's asking what's typical, how exactly what's the, I guess, common way to implement this in Laravel. And that one, I don't know what y'all think. The most I've seen is, Laravel has its app error catcher thing that just logs the error, and then most of my Laravel work is building REST APIs, so it's less returning like form errors back to the user and more of just I throw the exception in the repository classes responsible for doing everything, and then in the controller, depending on how I'm doing it, I either catch it and return a specific message, or since I'm using a fancy API-centric package for Laravel, the exception I throw is already in a format how I want to, so I just let the exception throw and bubble all the way up to the specific handler and don't really worry about it. So, does anybody have any input on how they handle errors in their Laravel applications?
We're in the same situation. We're on API, so we just store the error and send off the status code and a message, a generic message that won't get us in trouble with hacking.
So it's a little bit more involved, actually. So the way that we've been going is we have a base standard error exception class that extends the native, the root PHP exception class.
Right.
So we have an exception namespace. So we have all these exception types in that namespace, like invalid token exception, invalid bad validation exception, all these different exception cases that you can think of.
Right.
And then what we do is whenever we have a validation that fails, we throw in an invalid validation exception. And then we register you can have multiple error handlers that are type hinted, so that any exception that gets thrown, that extends our standardized error response exception will be caught by this specific one. And what its job is to log the error and actually send back the response with the right error code, but also in like a JSON format.
Right.
And in the format that the app can always expect. So basically, because we do APIs too, so whenever our app encounters an HTTP code that is not 200, that's its signal that it needs to look at the response. And there'll always be a message node, and then there'll always be of course there's a response code, there's a message node, and then there's like a status node in the response.
Right.
So, I mean, and I've heard people say to the contrary too, that it's not good to use exceptions for validation problems, and I don't know if there's one of them.
Yeah, there's always the preference and opinions of like, oh, this is how I do it. Well, you're wrong. Why? Because I said okay.
Which is so easy to like, you know, we have probably 5 or 6 different exception classes, and whenever we encounter an exception, for me is whenever you encounter a condition that will stop execution of the application, basically.
Exactly.
This one will throw an exception, and then the Laravel will handle capturing the exception and then doing something meaningful with it. And then in some cases, we have some of the very special exceptions that when we hit those, we might have some other specialized logic to, you know, maybe send an email or do something other than what our base exception handler does. It just depends on what kind of stuff we're looking at. So.
Right. That's pretty much how I work it. Since I use the Dingo API package for Laravel, which helps a lot with building APIs, it has various exceptions that extend the Symfony HTTP exception class. So it automatically has the status code built into the class and then the message. And basically I just throw, like, if they try to create something and the validation fails, I just throw a store resource failed exception with the message, and then it automatically sets the status code
Does it get the response code from the code member variable in the exception?
Say that one more time, sorry.
So like in the exception class, there's a code member variable. So like when you call the get code method, you get the error code back. So we actually store the HTTP code in that member variable, basically.
It's possible.
Or are they all 500s? Like basically, can you control the code that gets sent back?
You can control the code, but by default, certain ones are set, like the custom Dingo ones are set to, the only ones he has are really 4 of them for, well, that one's part of Symfony, but the store, update, and delete, and okay, 3. I just swore there was a 4th one. All those just take a message, and then you can override the code to use a different one if you want, but by default it uses 422 unprocessable entity, which I've heard that 422 is not the right one, but and then 400 is really not the right one either. And I'm just gonna use 422, and the people who are using my API will just know if you get a 422, you screwed up, and here's the reason why in the JSON. So what's nice is that Dingo already has its custom error handler, since it has a custom router that it overrides in Laravel that does all the same stuff as Laravel, but the special API stuff as well. So if it catches one of those Symfony, if it catches a exception that extends off of HTTP exception, then it automatically pulls the message, pulls the code, makes the JSON, kicks it out. I don't have to worry about app error catches or anything like that. It just goes. And then the downside of using that is that since I'm just throwing it and not doing anything at the moment, is that if I wanted to log that somebody screwed up the validation, I could, but at the moment I don't see the purpose of logging every single time somebody screwed up the validation in production, because then the Sentry logs in my current workplace is going to get saturated with people doing stupid stuff with the API instead of actual errors. So that's kind of the way I do it for the API stuff. I've seen, I think in like, I guess more of the applications that actually render views and everything, with forms and all that fancy stuff, I don't see the problem with using the exception method still, of just throwing the exception from whatever is doing all your calculations, be it repository, hopefully not the controller, but if you're already in the controller, you probably don't need to throw the exception, and then just catching it in the controller. That way you can just, if the exception happens, you catch it, log it, whatever, and then return back to, I guess, where they just left with the errors flashed into the session, and then in the view, just if errors printed out. Woo! But that, I haven't really seen anything different from that, so, and based on what I've heard,
As
it's,
far as like validation, are you doing those directly in controllers or like setting up like service providers for that stuff?
I'm right now using the validator make, but I'm using it inside the repositories, which is fine, except for the fact that it kind of puts that hard dependency on Laravel's validation if I wanted to use the repositories in another framework. But since we have no plans of switching off of Laravel at any point in time, at the moment I just decided, validator make, get it done, not going to cause any problems. What I've looked into and was kind of forced to with the project I'm working on right now, thanks to Confide and its new way of doing validation, is the actual validation class approach to it, which is kind of what's coming around in Laravel 4.3, where instead of using validator make and then saying like have the model store the rules for validation, you have a model validator class that has the create and update rules, the method that actually fires the validation, and then it handles what the error does if it fails from there. It either returns false and they're just doing if validator fire false, do whatever, but those are, in Laravel, most examples I've seen online are all validator make. And if it's not that, then it's the validator specific class for each resource. So I guess that kind of answers his, excuse me, next question about validating the right or common way. Do y'all do any validation differently or anything like that? Blank stares, blank stares.
What is that?
What's validation? One thing we don't do.
It really depends on the complexity of the app for me. If I have a lot of forms, I'll create a special validation class for each form, depending on how big it is. But even for Jubilee, for the main area where you just submit your form to build a report, it's only one input value or two input value. So I don't even make a class for it. I just make the validation rules right in the controller. So.
Yeah, the complexity definitely has a part in it. So for the API stuff, I just put the rules on the model. I just have like public rules equals an array, and then in that array is just two values, create and update. And then I just made a trait that added the get rules function, so you pass in what type of the rules you want, just because I wanted to play around with traits. You could probably do it a different way, or write the get rules function for each model. That's why I wrote the trait, so I didn't have to write it or copy and paste it 7 times over. Works just as well, and then, yeah, the validator classes.
It seems pretty easy, like, so people normally do it in the controller when you're doing validation, like other stuff.
I think why a lot of people do it in the controller is because their thought process, which I mean, I used to have this thought process myself when I was first getting comfortable with Laravel and all those fancy validation things, was, okay, I need to validate this data and I have a class that's going to do stuff with it. Or I should validate it before it gets to that class so that class can just do its thing and know everything's fine. So let me do it in the controller before firing off the data to that class. So I think that's why a lot of people do a lot of validation heavy stuff in the controller.
Or
and
do it wherever you're doing the form processing.
Exactly. So like for me, I do it in repositories since I kind of latched onto the repository pattern. And I've seen it in a lot of the Laravel, or a lot of various Laravel things, but I do mine in the repository. If it's something as non-complex as checking 2 values. I don't think you're going to be a horrible programmer if you validate in the controller. I think you'll be just fine. Hopefully your other developers will
At least you
understand
validate.
it. Yeah, at least you're validating. And the thing that I added to it is, as long as you're validating and not just saying, sure, everything's fine, you're already off to a good start. It may be in the controller, which is, you'll learn, fledgling programmer, that's not the place to put it, but you're doing it, so that's a good step in the right direction.
So have you guys done talks on validation or error handling in Laravel? That might be, I don't know if it would be a full talk, but those seem like great, like lightning talk, like 20 minutes or something on.
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking. Like, I'm probably gonna can these for basically if I can't find anybody to talk, then I'll put these on a list of things to go, oh crap, can't find anybody to talk, what can I talk about for a few minutes? And then have that list there. So I think those will be some pretty good topics. I'm not sure, hopefully they last 20 minutes, depends on how fast you talk, but and questions, so. I don't really have any other questions, and I'm getting blank faces, so I don't think y'all have many questions. One thing that I would like to ask, though, is I started playing around with this idea in IRC today, and I think, or out of everyone here, how many of you are like beginners to Laravel? Haven't really used it a ton, or trying to learn more? Okay, so I think I'm trying to basically get more people to show up. I mean, we had 22 people RSVP, and then not all 22 people showed up, but this is actually a lot. And Blake and Tom being late.
We weren't late, we were across the hall.
Yeah, we were in the other room, we thought you didn't show up.
There's a sign right when you walk in the door that points this way.
This is ridiculous, Hunter isn't here.
What's funny, I got into IRC and I was gonna bug y'all on there, going late, but then I was like, oh, they're probably, I started talking about dinner and stuff, so I was like, oh, they're probably busy, other things to do. But the idea that I'm throwing around is basically outside of the normal schedule of the meetups, so something that would happen on the weekend and maybe a little bit longer, thinking maybe something close to lunchtime, so start at like 10:30, 10:45, break around noon for lunch, have pizza, drinks brought up here or whatever. We can all go somewhere, I don't care. And then after eat, come back and finish. And this maybe be something that spans multiple weekends, but kind of like a crash course on Laravel. So instead of talking about various topics, we'll actually, myself or if somebody else wants to volunteer, will stand up here and go, today we're going to build a blank in Laravel. And then he or she will do his thing on the laptop. You can bring your laptops and follow along. That format's the format as long as someone's sitting up here talking and then you're all sitting out there on laptops coding, that will stick. As for how I'm gonna do that, I might follow the same format that my first experience in the Capital Factory was, sitting right over there with Apogee, doing jQuery mobile and Cordova stuff with Apogee's various APIs. Basically, I'll say something along the lines of, all right, we're gonna do this and give you the kind of like starter bit of code, and then you go do it, and then after a few minutes where I think I can tell everyone's kind of finished with it, I'll go, okay, so let's take a look at how I did it. It's not the correct way, but it's the way that I've seen it done mostly, and it works and follows good programming principles. And basically step through building a micro-blogging platform. So basically a very small, dumb version of Twitter, because quick to build, easy to understand, has all the CRUD principles. So if y'all would be interested in something like that, let me know. I'm getting some head nods and thumbs up, so. And if you know Laravel, like the back of your hand, you still want to come, then please do. The more the merrier. And maybe you'll learn something new. Maybe you can pipe in and teach something to all of us, including myself, and everything will be great. So, I would like it to be here at the Capital Factory. I gotta go talk to the lovely people at the front desk and see what the availability is for weekends. I don't think it's gonna be this month, unless it just happens to be they have something available. If they do, then I will send a message out through the Meetup site and let y'all know time, date, all that good stuff. I'd like to try and keep it free, but it might be a little like pitch in $5 for the food that comes at the middle. I don't know. That depending on how or what time I get. If it's not around lunchtime, then I'd like to keep it so there's no like little fee thing, since I think we have to pay Capital Factory for that. I don't know. Terry knows that. So once I find out more details of when that's going to happen, I will let all of you know. And hopefully, the goal is to get more people more familiar with Laravel so that we can get more people showing up and listening to these more advanced tactics. Because I can imagine someone who just looked at Laravel and said, oh, that's cool, but I have no idea what's going on. And then hearing Inversion Recursion would probably look at it like, aww, and explode and leave and never come back. So hopefully it gets people more comfortable with the framework, and then we can get more attendees.
Just build a microblogging service all code igniter style. Just put it everywhere, man.
No.
I'm going through the getting started book, and like
That's how it is, right?
it's everything's in the routes. Like
Yeah, you just put everything in routes.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm thinking of doing for the actual Laravel thing, is go through the pace. The idea is to basically go through the paces of doing it crap and making it better.
Well, the good strategy is to make it work first, and then be like, okay, this is how you make it
Better.
clean it up.
Yep. So I could go really ridiculous and have all the code in the routes.php file first, and then go, okay, so this is
I'll come to the second one.
it'll be real quick.
The first one would be funny.
It'll basically be, all right, so everything's in the routes and it works, but as you can see, this routes file is like 3,000 lines long. So let's take everything in this little closure and go cut, and then make a controller paste. Make, hey, it still works. Okay, now let's make that controller better, and then make that better. Go as far down the rabbit hole as I can without taking 3 years to get through the whole entire thing. So that's the idea. Thank you for coming.
Service managers and do modules, all sorts of stuff.
Maybe not modules, since Laravel doesn't really have like a modules thing. Like, I mean, it has the packages, but
Packages is for vendor packages.
yeah.
But you can set up service managers for modules, so you can break up controllers.
Well, and since you have auto loading with your composer, you can create a module and really stick it anywhere and just have it call when it needs.
Yeah, and I mean, what I'm thinking of when you say module is, I guess, how I do things. Where, for the example, I'm working on something called a rule, and all the custom classes, like the repositories and the transformers and everything, are all namespaced under a rule folder that's in a lib folder in applib rule. That's just PSR4 auto loaded. So all that's there, and then there's a service provider that gets loaded in with the app config file to actually bind all the classes into the container. That's kind of what I'm getting the vibe of by what you mean of modules.
Yeah,
But
and just to break up, so you don't have, same thing, you don't want to like put all your routes in one spot.
right,
Break up break your application up into folders to namespace out, and then have service managers that control your routes for specific, I guess, however you want to break it up. If you want to break up however you want to break up your application, and have service managers and routes all in one folder. That way, if you want to just routes that are specific to that, that module, it's all there. So you have to go searching through all the controllers, all the models, all the routes to find, for that specific area.
right. It's definitely a good topic. I'm not sure if I'll cover it in this type of thing, just because it's more of a get people more familiar with Laravel, but it's definitely a good topic to cover during these meetups as an actual, like, the whole PowerPoint presentation, and here's how you use them, and here's why you use them, and now I'm gonna show you one that is coded, and I think that'd be a good talk for one of the meetups. So if you want to do it, let me know.
It would be really interesting. And would you want to do it in 4.3, even if it's the beta? It was before the that could be interesting.
Yeah, I haven't thought that far ahead. I think the thing that will determine the main thing that will determine what version we use is when we actually get to do this. I'm hoping it's not way out into the future, but
like 7.
yeah, if I can actually get this organized before November, then I think before we actually do it, what I might do is just blast out to the group saying, hey, if you're coming, what would you rather see?
2 or 3.
4.2 or 4.3, and go from there. And I might even, if I do go with 4.2, then what I might do is actually just have 2 different branches or 2 different tagged versions that basically show, here's all the stuff we did in 4.2. If you're curious on how you would upgrade this to 4.3, look at the GitHub repo and then email me or tweet at me if you have any questions, something like that. And it could also be a follow-up in a future meetup, things like that. But if it's in November, basically if 4.3 gets launched before we do it, then we'll do it in 4.3. But if we do this before 4.3 officially launches, then chances are it'll be 4.2, here's how you upgrade it to 4.3. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Sometimes I'll mention this, sometimes every once in a while we go grab a drink or 2 afterwards. Depends on how I'm feeling. So if you'd like to join us, stick around as we figure out where the heck we're gonna go. And if not, once again, thanks for coming. Adam, are you gonna be able to put the PowerPoints on?
I'm uploading them right now.
Okay. Adam's gonna post the links to his PowerPoint slides onto the Meetup site. So for the 2 of you that missed it, you can take a look at it. And for everyone else that RSVP'd and said, yeah, we'll be there, and then forgot to come, they can take a look at it as well. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.